The wagon driver didn't even wait for her to climb all the way down. He just loosened his grip on the reins, let the step drop, and said, "End of the line, ma'am," without looking at her. Eliza Hartwell got one foot on the wooden step, the other still searching for solid ground, and the horse shifted forward just enough to send her stumbling into the mud of Blackstone Valley's main street. She caught herself with one hand. The other arm never let go of Ethan. The baby made a sound, not quite a cry, more like a complaint, and she pressed him tighter against her chest, stood up straight, and looked around at a town that was already looking back at her. It was the kind of look that didn't need words. November 1875. The Rockies weren't visible from Blackstone Valley, but you could feel them. The cold came down off those peaks like something with a purpose, and by late afternoon it had teeth. Eliza had been on that wagon bench for 11 hours with a wool blanket that had 2 holes in it and a baby who'd been running a low fever since the night before. Her dress was the color it had started out, dark green, but the hem was crusted with the mud of 4 different towns. Her hair had been pinned up that morning and was now mostly down. She looked, in other words, exactly like what she was. A woman who had come a very long way with very little. The street had the usual arrangement of a frontier settlement trying to convince itself it was more than temporary. A general store with a porch that listed slightly to the left. A livery stable with smoke coming from somewhere inside it. A hotel with a sign that said Blackstone Arms in letters that someone had painted with confidence and then run out of paint partway through the S. A saloon that didn't bother with a sign at all because everyone knew what it was. A church at the far end, white, small, with a bell that wasn't ringing. And people. Not many, but enough. A woman in a good coat standing outside the dry goods store watching. 2 men by the livery who'd stopped their conversation. A girl of maybe 12 on the hotel porch, staring openly the way children do before someone teaches them not to. Eliza picked up her traveling bag from where it had fallen in the mud, wiped her hand on her skirt, and walked toward the hotel. She made it about 15 feet before the woman in the good coat said something to the woman beside her that Eliza didn't quite catch, and both of them turned away. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. The man at the hotel desk had a face like a book that had been read too many times in bad light. Deep lines, pale eyes, a mustache that needed attention. He looked at Eliza when she came through the door, looked at Ethan, and the calculation that crossed his face was so fast she almost missed it. Almost. "Need a room," she said. "Just 1 night, maybe 2. I have money." She did have money. Not much. $19 and some change, which was what remained after the wagon fare and a week in a boarding house in Ridgeway while Ethan's fever ran its course. But she had it, and she put $3 on the counter, which was the going rate she'd been told. The man looked at the money. He looked at her. He looked at Ethan, who had his face turned against Eliza's shoulder and was making small sounds of displeasure at the cold. "We're full," the man said. Eliza looked around the lobby. There was nobody in it except her and him and a cat asleep on a chair by the window. "You're full," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She picked up 2 of the $3, left 1 on the counter. "What about a room in the back? Doesn't have to be much. I have an infant." "I can see that." He didn't touch the dollar. "We're full." She picked up the last dollar, put it back in her bag, turned around, and walked out. So, the general store was warmer, at least. There was a stove in the corner and she stood near it while she looked at the shelves, bouncing Ethan gently because he'd started to fuss. A tin of crackers. Some dried beef. She needed to eat something because she hadn't since morning and the milk wasn't going to keep if she didn't. She was calculating prices in her head when she became aware that the woman behind the counter had come out from behind it and was standing about 4 feet away, watching her. "Can I help you?" The tone of it made clear that helping wasn't actually on offer. "Just shopping," Eliza said. "I'd like a tin of those crackers and some of that beef." "You got a husband somewhere?" Eliza kept her voice level. "I'm a widow." The woman's eyes dropped to Ethan. "How old's the baby?" 4 months? Another sound. Not quite a word. The math was happening, and Eliza could see it happening, and she was so tired in a way that went past the bones into something underneath them, that she almost said something she would have regretted. She breathed instead. "I'd just like the crackers and the beef, please." "I think," the woman said carefully, like she was being generous by phrasing it this way, that you might want to try the next town over. Harder Creek, about 18 miles east. Folks there are, she paused, more tolerant of certain situations. Eliza put her money away. I'll find somewhere else to shop then. You do that. By 4 o'clock, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees and Ethan was crying in earnest. Not the low-grade complaint from before, real crying, the kind that meant he was cold and hungry and done with all of it. Eliza was done with all of it too, but she didn't have that option, so she found the narrow alley between the saloon and what appeared to be a tanner's shop, got out of the wind, and sat on a crate and unbuttoned her coat and her dress and fed him. She sat there while he ate and watched the street and tried to think. $18. The next town was 18 miles away and the wagon wouldn't run again until morning, assuming the driver would take her, which wasn't guaranteed. She had no idea if Harder Creek would be any different. She had no idea if anywhere would be any different. She'd left her sister's house in Missouri because her sister's husband had made it clear, not with words exactly, but clearly, that she and Ethan weren't welcome to stay past winter, and she'd heard there was work in the territories for women willing to work hard. And she'd believed it because she'd needed to believe something. Now she was sitting in an alley with her back to a wall that smelled like animal hides, feeding a baby in the cold, and the believing was getting harder to sustain. Ethan finished. She buttoned herself back up, shifted him to her shoulder, rubbed his back until he burped, and then sagged against her with the sudden contentment of the very young, who can go from misery to satisfaction in under a minute. She put her chin on top of his head and thought, okay, what do you have? What do you actually have? $19 minus nothing, since she hadn't managed to buy anything. A bag with 2 dresses, some underclothes, a blanket, Ethan's things. Her own health, which was holding. Ethan's fever had broken 4 days ago, and his color was good. She was 23 years old, and she had, as far as anyone could tell, driven herself to the edge of nowhere and run out of road. That was what she had. She was still sitting there, working out the problem, when she heard voices from the street. A man's voice, raised, and then a woman's responding, and then the sound of other people gathering the way they did when there was something to watch. She shouldn't have gone to look. She knew that later. But Ethan had gone quiet, and she was cold, and she'd been sitting in that alley alone for long enough that even the prospect of witnessing someone else's trouble was better than continuing to sit with her own. So she moved to the edge of the alley and looked out. The crowd that had gathered was small, maybe 8 people. But it had arranged itself in the way crowds arrange themselves when they've already decided something. The rough horseshoe shape, the space in the center that belonged to nobody. In the center was the woman from the general store, and a man Eliza didn't recognize, heavy-set, with a watch chain across his vest and the general bearing of someone who'd been important in this town for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. Eliza didn't know who he was yet. She would learn his name soon enough. Wade Crowley. But right now he was just the heavy-set man with the watch chain, and he was talking. Don't want that kind of element in Blackstone Valley, he was saying. We've worked hard to build something decent here, a family town, and a woman who shows up with an illegitimate child and no husband. I told her to try Harder Creek, the general store woman said. That's right. That's the charitable thing to do. But if she's still here by morning, she might be some kind of confidence scheme, someone else offered. A younger man, eager to contribute. Could be, Crowley said. He had the voice of a man who'd learned that agreeing with people made them feel like he was listening. These things happen. Women in her situation, they learn to work the sympathy angle, get a few dollars here and there. He shook his head, sorrowful about the state of the world. I just think, for the sake of the families in this town, the children, she's got a child herself, someone said. A woman, toward the back. Quieter than the rest. A brief pause. Then, which is exactly why she should move along, find a place more suited to her circumstances. Crowley spread his hands. Reasonable, generous, a man just trying to do right. Nobody's driving her out. We're just making clear that Blackstone Valley has certain standards. Eliza looked at the crowd, looked at the faces. Most of them were not cruel people, probably. Most of them would have been horrified to be described as cruel, but they were standing there, and they were nodding, and they were doing the thing that not cruel people do sometimes, which is let someone else say the cruel thing so they don't have to. She was about to go back to her crate and her cold alley when she heard the sound of a horse. He came in from the north end of town on a buckskin mare that looked like she'd been ridden hard. The man on her back was tall, even sitting down. Broad through the shoulders, a jaw that was about 3 days past needing a razor, a hat that had been battered by enough weather to be considered a geological event. He wore a canvas coat with the collar turned up, and he had the look of someone who spent most of his time somewhere other than town and came in only when he absolutely had to. He pulled up at the edge of the small crowd and sat there for a moment, taking in the scene. His eyes moved from Crowley to the cluster of townspeople to, Eliza noticed this, the general shape of the alley where she was standing, though she didn't think he'd seen her specifically. "Something going on?" he said. His voice was lower than Crowley's, not as practiced. "Cole?" Crowley said it like a greeting that was also a warning. "Nothing to concern yourself with. Town business." "Who decided that?" "The decent people of this valley." Crowley's voice had shifted just slightly. Not much, but Eliza caught it. "There's a woman with an illegitimate child who's been bothering the local businesses. Where is she?" A pause. "Somewhere in town. She'll move on." "Bothering businesses." The man on the horse, Cole, said it flatly. "That what Ruth called it when she turned her away from the store?" The general storewoman's face went stiff. "I didn't turn anyone away." "Margaret said you did." He glanced at the woman toward the back, the one who'd said the thing about the child. "Said you told her to try Harder Creek." "I gave her advice." "In this cold?" He looked at the sky. "With an infant." He said it like he was just noting facts. Not an accusation, just facts. "What's the temperature tonight supposed to get down to?" Nobody answered. He nodded once, like that confirmed something. Then he looked around the crowd, and something in his face, it wasn't anger exactly, but it was in the neighborhood, made people stop looking directly at him. "Wade," he said, "I know you've got opinions about most things in this valley. I've been listening to them for 6 years. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was as far from a show of respect as you could get while still technically doing it. "Appreciate you sharing them." He turned the horse. Eliza, still standing at the mouth of the alley, made a decision. She didn't have a better word for what she did. It wasn't exactly brave, because brave implied options, and her options were getting thin. She stepped out of the alley. "Excuse me." He pulled up, looked down at her. She looked back at him, which took a small effort because he was on a horse and the horse was taller than she'd realized up close, and because he had the kind of face that didn't give you much to work with. Not unfriendly exactly, but settled, like he'd made up his mind about most things and wasn't currently in the market for new information. "You're the woman," he said. Not a question. "I'm Eliza Hartwell," she said. "This is my son, Ethan." She shifted Ethan on her hip. "I heard what you said. I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for work and a place to stay, and I haven't found either in this town, and I'm trying to figure out what to do next." He looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at her. "Work," he said. "I can cook, I can clean, I can keep books if you have them. I'm not weak, and I don't complain, and I don't—" She stopped herself because she was starting to sound like she was auditioning, and she'd told herself she wouldn't do that. "I'm just telling you what I can offer." Behind her, she could feel the weight of the small crowd watching. Crowley said something under his breath that she didn't catch and didn't try to. The man on the horse was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ranch is 12 miles out. Not much to look at. Winter's going to be hard." "I've had hard winters." "Kitchen's a mess. Haven't had anyone cooking regular for 2 years. You'd have your own room, you and the boy, pays $8 a month, which isn't much, but room and board on top of it." "That's fair," she said, because it was. He nodded. "Horse can take 2. It's a long ride in this cold." He looked at Ethan again. "Boy gonna make it 12 miles? He's tougher than he looks." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something smaller than that. "Most people are," he said. He reached down a hand. She took it, and he swung her up behind him with more ease than she'd expected, and she settled Ethan between them where the warmth of the horse could reach him, and Cole Mercer turned his mare north and rode out of Blackstone Valley without looking back at the crowd. Eliza did look back. Once. Crowley was watching them go, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who'd been defeated. It was the expression of a man who was now paying attention. The The 12 miles took the better part of 2 hours because he kept the horse to a walk, which she understood later was because of her and Ethan, though he didn't say so. He didn't say much of anything for the first hour. The cold settled in around them and she pulled her coat tighter and Ethan slept, which was a mercy. The baby warmth of him against her chest keeping her from thinking too hard about what she'd just done. She'd gotten on a horse with a stranger and was riding into the wilderness. That was the plain fact of it. She'd done it because the alternative was another night on that crate in that alley with the temperature still dropping, and because something in the way he'd spoken to that crowd, the flatness of it, the lack of performance, had registered as honest. She couldn't have explained it better than that. You spent enough time reading people out of necessity, and you started to develop a sense, and her sense said, not dangerous. She'd been wrong before, but she was going. How long have you had the ranch? She said, mostly to break the silence. 6 years, he said, since '69. Just you? Had a hand for a while. He moved on. A pause. It's a working ranch, horses mostly. Got 30 head right now, building up to 50. Feed them through winter, sell in spring. That's a lot of horses for one person to manage. Yes, he said. It is. She waited to see if he'd add something. He didn't. I'm not going to ask you why you did what you did, she said. Back in town. I'm just going to say I noticed that you didn't have to. Another silence, then, Crowley runs that town about 6 different ways, and most people let him because it's easier. Tonight, it just... He stopped. Didn't seem right, that's all. Well, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until you see the kitchen. The kitchen was, in fact, a mess. She saw it by lamplight when they arrived, Ethan awake again and red-faced from the cold, and the first thing Cole did was get a fire going in the stove with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. The second thing he did was gesture at the kitchen table and say, sit, which she did, and he disappeared and came back with a blanket that he draped around her shoulders without being asked. She sat there with Ethan on her lap and looked at the kitchen while Cole got the fire going enough to start heating water. Dirty dishes on the counter, 3 days old at least. A skillet with something dried in it that she was trying not to identify. A shelf of supplies that had been arranged with zero organizational logic. Coffee next to lamp oil next to what appeared to be a half-eaten tin of beans. A floor that had been swept at some point, weeks ago maybe. I can fix this, she said. He glanced over. Which part? All of it. I'll need to know where things are kept, and I'll need some things from town eventually. Flour, sugar, proper salt. Whatever you've got in here now, I can work with for the next few days. He nodded, turned back to the stove. She looked around the rest of what she could see from the table. The main room was large for a ranch house. A long table, 4 chairs, a fireplace that was dark right now, a window that looked out on nothing but black. The walls were bare except for a calendar from 1873 and a rifle on 2 hooks. Clean enough, but empty. The kind of room where a person lived but hadn't been living. How many rooms? She asked. 4. Kitchen, main room, 2 back rooms. I'm in the one on the left. He didn't look up. Other one's empty. Has a bed in it and a chest of drawers. It'll do for you and the boy. It'll do fine. He set a cup of water near the stove to heat. There's dried beef in the pantry and some cornmeal. I'll cook, she said. You just rode 12 miles in the cold. And you've been managing 30 horses alone. She stood up, shifted Ethan to her left hip. Where's the cornmeal? He looked at her for a moment, something passing across his face that wasn't quite assessment anymore, though it had started as that. Then he pointed at the pantry. They ate an hour later, cornbread that she made from what she found, some of the beef, boiled coffee. And they ate mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one on the ride over. More comfortable, less empty. Ethan fell asleep in the little nest she'd made him from her coat on the floor near the stove's warmth. Cole looked at him once, briefly, and then looked away with the care of someone who didn't want to be caught looking. He looks healthy, Cole said. He is. Had a fever last week, but it broke. Tough kid. He is, she agreed. She started clearing the plates. He stood up to help and she said, Sit, I'll get it. And he sat, which surprised her. Some men argued with that kind of statement on principle. Tomorrow I'll start on the kitchen properly, she said, and I'll need to know the schedule, when you eat, what you prefer. I'm not going to cook things you won't eat. I eat most things. Preferences? He thought about it, which she appreciated. He wasn't just saying no to be easy. Not fond of turnips, he said finally. Noted. That's probably the only strong opinion I have. She almost smiled. That'll make my job easier then. She finished washing the dishes, dried them, put them in what seemed like the right place, and then turned around and found him still at the table, coffee cup in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What? She said. Nothing. He looked down at his cup. Just, it's been quiet here for a while. She didn't know exactly what to say to that, so she said, well, it's not quiet anymore. She picked up Ethan, who stirred and made a small sound of protest at being moved, and carried him toward the back hallway. Then she stopped. Cole? He looked up. I'll do good work for you, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not someone who gives less than they've said they would. He held her gaze for a moment. I believe you, he said. And the thing about it was, it didn't sound like a thing people say. It sounded like something he'd actually decided. Good night, she said. Night, he said. The room was cold. She built it warmer with the extra blankets she found folded in the chest of drawers and made a safe place for Ethan between the wall and her own body. And she lay there in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the place. The wind outside that was consistent and loud, the occasional sound of the horses in the barn, once what might have been an owl. She was 23 years old. She was in a stranger's ranch house in the middle of nowhere, hired to keep the kitchen and cook the meals. She had a 4-month-old son and $19 and a change of clothes, and the town nearest to her had made clear she wasn't wanted. These were the facts. But she was warm, and Ethan was warm, and the cornbread she'd made from nearly nothing had been eaten clean, and the man at the table had said, I believe you like he meant it. She had been given worse starting points. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind worked at the corners of the house, looking for a way in. It didn't find one. That, she decided, was enough for tonight. The first week was an education in how much one person could be wrong about. Eliza had assumed, not arrogantly, just practically, that a kitchen neglected for 2 years would take 2 days to set right. She was off by 4. The grease that had built up on the back wall behind the stove had to be scraped with a knife. The pantry had things in it she couldn't identify and didn't try to, just wrapped them in an old flour sack and put them outside. The floorboards near the door had warped from water damage and caught the broom wrong, so you had to sweep from a specific angle or you just pushed dirt into the gaps. She learned the angle by the second day. Cole stayed out of her way while she worked, which she appreciated. He came in for coffee in the morning, noon, and evening, and ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint and usually without much conversation. He was gone before light and back after it, and the sounds of the ranch, horses, the barn door, the particular creak of the fence post nearest the well, became the sounds she organized her day around. Ethan was, unexpectedly, easy in that first week. He slept in a drawer she'd padded with a folded blanket and set on the kitchen table while she worked, and he seemed to take to the noise and the warmth of the stove the way babies sometimes do, with a placid openness that made her wonder if he was just relieved to be somewhere that wasn't moving. She talked to him while she cooked, which was a habit she'd started when he was born and couldn't stop now, narrating what she was doing in the low voice she used for him. We're making biscuits, Ethan. You watch. One day you'll make them too, and you'll do a better job than me, probably. On the 4th morning, Cole came in for coffee and stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he said anything. It's different, he said. Cleaner, she said. That too. He looked at the shelf where she'd reorganized the supplies into some order a person could navigate. Then he looked at the stove, which she'd blacked that morning for the first time in what was apparently a long time. The floor, swept from the left. The boards are warped near the door, so you have to... Never mind. I'll show you later if you need to sweep while I'm with Ethan. He poured his coffee, sat at the table. How'd you figure that out? Swept it wrong first. She was making oatmeal, stirring against the bottom of the pot because it stuck if you didn't. Most things I know I figured out by doing it wrong first. He looked at Ethan, who was awake in his drawer, and making the small exploratory sounds of a baby who'd slept well. "You sleep all right? Better than me, he always does." "You not sleeping?" She shrugged. "New place. Takes me a week to sleep right somewhere new." She didn't add that she'd also been lying awake doing the math on $19 and $8 a month, and how long it would take to have enough of a cushion that if this didn't work out, she'd have options. The math wasn't terrible, but it wasn't comfortable either. "Oatmeal all right?" she said. "I didn't see any eggs." "Chickens stopped laying in October. They'll pick it up again in spring." "Oatmeal's fine then." She set the bowl in front of him and he ate, and she ate standing at the counter, which was a habit she hadn't examined yet. And Ethan made increasingly opinionated sounds from his drawer until she went and picked him up and brought him to the table, and he sat in her lap and looked at Cole with the wide-eyed seriousness that babies have about strangers. Cole looked back at him. "He stares," he said. "He's curious. He does it to everyone." She spooned some oatmeal, blew on it, offered it to Ethan on the tip of her finger. He made a face. "Not yet," she told him. "Few more weeks." Cole watched this process with the expression of a man seeing something he didn't have a category for. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. "Do you have family?" she asked. Not intrusively, just filling the space. "Brother in Kansas, we don't write much." He drank his coffee. "You?" "A sister in Missouri. She's got her own situation." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask. That was the longest conversation they'd had at that point. It didn't feel long. It felt like something that had been waiting for the right temperature to happen. By the end of the first month, she understood the rhythm of the place. Cole was up at 4:30 and in the barn by 5. The horses needed feeding, watering, checking. He was meticulous about it in the way of someone who'd learned the hard way what happened when you weren't. He came in at 7 for breakfast, went back out, came in at noon for whatever she had ready, and then again at dusk. He worked in the dark some nights, by lantern, when there was something that needed doing and daylight hadn't been enough to do it. She learned which of the 30 horses had what temperament, not from Cole directly, but from watching through the kitchen window, which had a sight line to the barn door. The gray mare, Cora, who he handled differently than the others, quieter and with more patience, was the one she asked about one evening. "She's got a bad knee," he said. "She'll never be sold. She's here." "How long?" 4 years. He didn't say anything else about it, but something in the way he'd said "she's just here" made Eliza think that the gray mare with the bad knee was maybe a more important animal to Cole Mercer than all the 30 healthy ones. She started making coffee strong enough the way he liked it by the end of the second week. He never said anything about it, but he started finishing the cup before he went back out instead of leaving half, which she took as confirmation. Small calibrations. That was what the first month was. She also wrote a letter to her sister, not asking for anything, just saying where she was and that she and Ethan were safe. She didn't know if her sister would write back. She sent it anyway because not sending it felt like giving up on something she hadn't decided to give up on yet. Muck. It was Ethan who cracked him open first. She saw it happening and didn't interfere. It started with Ethan learning to laugh. The real laugh, not the reflex, the one that meant he'd gotten a joke. Or at least what passed for a joke when you were 5 months old, which mostly meant something had surprised him. Cole came in one afternoon in early December, cold off him in waves, stamping his boots at the door, and Ethan was on the blanket on the kitchen floor where she'd put him, and he looked up at Cole and Cole made the boot stamping sound again, and Ethan laughed. Cole stopped. Eliza, who was at the stove, kept stirring. Cole stamped his boot again. Ethan laughed again, bigger this time, a full-body affair that involved his arms and legs moving simultaneously. She heard something from Cole that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh of his own. More of an exhale, but his face had done something different when she glanced over, something younger and less guarded than usual. And he stood there for a moment like he'd forgotten what he'd come in for. "He does that with anything sudden," she said. "Boot noise, a sneeze, the barn door." Cole crouched down, at a distance that was respectful of Ethan's potential opinions on strangers getting close, and looked at the baby. Ethan looked back at him with the absolute concentration of an infant assessing a situation. Then Cole slowly stamped his foot on the kitchen floor, a controlled version, and Ethan lost his mind with delight. Cole stood up, cleared his throat. "Coffee ready?" "It's on the stove," she said. But after that, she noticed that when Cole came in for coffee and Ethan was on the floor, Cole would sometimes crouch down, still at that careful distance, and do the foot thing, or blow out his cheeks at him, or just look at him in a way that he'd stop trying to make look like not looking. Ethan, for his part, had decided Cole was the most interesting thing on the ranch and tracked him across any room they were in together with the dedication of a very small astronomer who had identified a new celestial body and wasn't going to lose it. She didn't say anything about this. She just watched. The first real trouble arrived on a Tuesday in December, gray and cold, when a rider came down the north track and tied up at the gate. Eliza saw him from the kitchen window. Heavy horse, well-fed, not a working animal, the kind of horse that carried someone who didn't do the kind of work that wore horses out. She dried her hands and went to the door. The man at the gate wasn't someone she recognized, but he had the look of someone who worked for someone else. That particular combination of dressed well and deferential that meant he was comfortable, but not the one in charge. "Cole Mercer in?" he said. "He's in the barn," she said. "I can get him." "Appreciate it." Cole came out of the barn when she called, looked at the rider, and his face did a thing she hadn't seen before, but a brief flattening, all expression leaving it at once. He walked to the gate without rushing. "Hendricks," he said. "Mr. Mercer, Mr. Crowley asked me to bring you this." He passed a folded paper over the gate. Cole opened it, read it. His jaw tightened. "You can tell Crowley my answer's the same as last time," he said. He folded the paper and held it back out to Hendricks. Hendricks didn't take it. "He thought you might say that. He also wanted me to mention that the Dillard property sold last month, and the Aaron's place the month before." "I know." "He says the pressure's going to keep up. He says—" Hendricks glanced at Eliza, then back at Cole. "He says you've got enough problems without adding new ones." Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You do your job, Hendricks, and I respect that. But you can take this back and you can tell him that if he's got something to say to me, he can come say it himself." Hendricks took the paper, nodded once the way men do when they don't have anything to add but aren't ready to leave yet. Then he turned his horse and went back down the track. Cole watched him go. Then he came back toward the house, and Eliza moved away from the door so she wasn't standing right in it when he came up the steps. But he paused on the porch and looked at the horizon for a moment, and she waited. "What did the paper say?" she asked. "Offer to buy the ranch." He opened the door. "Third one." "How much?" He told her. She thought about it. "That's not a bad offer," she said carefully. "It's below what the land is worth, and he knows it." He went to the stove, poured coffee. "He's been buying up properties in this valley for 2 years. Every one that went under, he was there with a number that was just enough to get people out. He's got a plan for this valley, and I'm in the way of it." "What's the plan?" "Railroad." He sat down. "There's a survey going through this territory. If the line comes through the valley instead of going over the ridge, the land values triple. He wants to own as much of it as possible before that happens." She sat down across from him. "And if you sell, then he's got the North Corridor locked up." His hands were around the cup. "My land sits right where the line would have to cross. Without it, the valley route doesn't work." She was quiet for a moment, and that's why he wants it. That's why he's been wanting it for 2 years. He looked at her. Before I came back from town in November with a woman and a baby, he was just sending letters. Now, he stopped. "Now he's sending writers," she said. "Yes." She looked at her hands. "Cole, if I'm making this harder for you, you're not making it harder." He said it quickly, which surprised her. "Crowley was after this land before you got here. That's not your doing. But the things he said in town, Crowley says things. He picks up whatever's available to use." He set the cup down. "Right now, that's you. Before it was my water rights, and before that, it was a boundary dispute I'd already won in court." He shook his head. "He's not going to stop because you leave. He'll find something else." She looked at him. "You're sure?" "I know the man," Cole said, and the flatness in his voice said that he knew the man the way you know something you didn't want to know. Through experience that cost something. "All right," she said. "All right. Then we figure out what to do about it." She stood up and went back to the stove. "Supper will be ready in an hour." He looked at the table for a moment after she turned away, and she didn't see his face, but she heard him push the chair back and get up, and his footsteps going toward the back room were slower than usual, like he was carrying something. The whispers reached them by way of Margaret Pruitt, the woman who'd spoken up at the back of the crowd that first night in Blackstone Valley. She rode out to the ranch on a Saturday morning in January without sending word first, just appeared at the gate on a brown horse with a saddlebag and a look on her face that said she'd thought about whether to come the whole way there. Eliza saw her from the porch and went to the gate. "Mrs. Hartwell," Margaret said. She was somewhere in her 40s, plain-faced, with quick eyes, and a directness that Eliza had noticed that first night. "I don't know if you remember me." "I do," Eliza said. "You were the one who said I had a child." Margaret had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I didn't do enough. I know that." She reached into the saddlebag and brought out a cloth-wrapped parcel. "I brought some dried apple from my own stock." Eliza took it. "Come in and have coffee." They sat at the kitchen table while Ethan slept in the back room, and Margaret said what she'd come to say without a lot of preamble, which Eliza respected. "Crowley's been talking," she said. "Not just about you, though you come up. He's been putting it around that that the situation out here isn't what it looks like, that Cole brought you out here for reasons that aren't decent." She paused. "You understand what I mean?" "I understand. There are people who don't believe him, but there are people who listen because it's easier than not listening, and Crowley knows how to talk to those people." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He's also been saying that your boy's father is still alive somewhere, that you're not actually a widow." "My husband died of fever in August," Eliza said. "I have the death record. I believe you. That's not the point. The point is that Crowley doesn't need people to believe him. He just needs them to wonder." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I've seen him do this before, with the Dillard family 2 years ago. He didn't go after the land directly. He went after the wife's reputation first. Inside of 6 months, the Dillards were so worn down from the social pressure they sold just to get out from under it." Eliza looked at the table. "And you're telling me this because you didn't do anything wrong," Margaret said, "and because I didn't say enough that first night. And it's been sitting with me." She set her cup down. "And because Cole Mercer is a decent man who's been alone out here long enough, and he doesn't deserve to have Crowley use you against him." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. Outside, faintly, the sound of Cole working near the barn. "What would you suggest?" Eliza said. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly, "but I thought you should know what's being said." She stood up. "How are you managing out here? The two of you?" Eliza almost said fine from habit. Then she stopped and actually thought about it. "Better than I expected," she said. "He's not easy to know, but he's fair, and he works hard, and he doesn't make me feel like a problem he's stuck with." Margaret looked at her carefully. "He's not an easy man, but there's not a mean bone in him." She pulled on her coat. "I'll come again if you want. In town, you'd be welcome at my table for what that's worth." "It's worth something," Eliza said. "Thank you." After Margaret left, Eliza stood at the window for a long time, looking out at nothing in particular. Then Cole came in from outside, stamped his boots, and stopped when he saw her face. "What?" he said. She told him what Margaret had said. All of it, straight through, no softening. His expression didn't change much while she spoke, but something around his eyes went tight and stayed that way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I know what he's doing," he said. "I told you." "I know you did. I wanted you to know what's being said specifically, because it involves me and it involves Ethan, and I think you deserve to know what you're dealing with." He looked at her. "Does it change anything for you?" "No," she said. "Then it doesn't change anything for me either." It wasn't a grand declaration. He said it the same way he said most things, flatly, like a fact. But she felt it land somewhere anyway. February came in brutal and stayed that way. 3 weeks of temperatures that made going outside a negotiation, and the snow that fell in the second week didn't melt because there wasn't enough warmth to melt it. The ranch shrank to the house and the barn and the path between them, packed down hard enough to walk without sinking. Cole lost a horse in the second week, one of the younger ones, a bay gelding he'd bought the previous spring with the intention of training him for sale. He found the horse in the morning, down in the stall, and the way he came back into the kitchen told her before he said anything. "The bay?" she said. "Yes." Was it the cold? Probably. His breathing wasn't right last week. I should have moved him to the better stall. He sat down. Didn't pour coffee, just sat. That's $300 gone. If I'd paid more attention, you were watching 30 horses in the worst cold in 2 years, she said. You can't watch all of them every minute. It was 3 weeks ago I noticed the breathing. I noted it and moved on. His jaw was tight. That's not the same as can't. She didn't argue with him because he was right. And arguing with a person when they're right, and they know it, and they're already being hard enough on themselves, is unkind. She poured him coffee instead and put it in front of him and went back to breakfast. He sat there for a bit and then he said, "Tell me what you need from town when I go in for supplies. Flour, salt, 2 more candles, and thread. I have thread, but not the right weight." He wrote it down. She watched him write, his handwriting, which was better than she'd expected. Neat, deliberate. The handwriting of someone who'd taken care with it once and kept the habit. "I'll go Thursday," he said, "if the track's passable. The thread isn't urgent. Everything else I can manage without." "I'll get the thread," he said. She didn't know why that stuck with her. It was thread. It was a small thing, but he'd written it down and said he'd get it, and she knew without having to think about it that he would, because that was who he was. Someone who said what he meant and did what he said, not because of performance, but because he didn't know another way to operate. She thought about that for a while after he went back out, thought about the kind of person it took to be like that and how many people she'd met in her life who weren't. Ethan started pulling himself up in late February. He did it first against the leg of the kitchen table, hauling himself upright with the grim determination of someone scaling something, and then standing there looking enormously pleased with himself for the 3 seconds before he sat back down hard. Eliza clapped. Ethan grinned. He did it again. By the end of the week, he was pulling himself up on anything he could reach. The table leg, the bottom shelf of the pantry, the dog that Cole had apparently owned and that Eliza hadn't known about because the dog spent most of its time in the barn. The dog's name was apparently Suet. He was black and medium-sized and had a calm temperament that bordered on philosophical, and he suffered Ethan's grip on his fur with the patience of a saint. Cole came in one evening and found Ethan standing upright against Soot's side, holding the dog's coat in both fists, looking across the kitchen floor with the expression of a general surveying territory. "He'd do that today," Cole said. "He's been doing it all week. He'll be walking by spring, I think." Cole looked at Ethan for a long moment. Ethan looked back at him and then, apparently deciding Cole was a suitable surface, let go of the dog and lurched toward him. He made it 2 steps, his first 2 steps, which Eliza was watching with her hand pressed to her mouth, before he sat down on the kitchen floor with a thump and looked up at Cole with an expression of absolute outrage. Cole crouched down. He held out his 2 index fingers at Ethan's level. Ethan grabbed them, pulled himself up, stood there, holding Cole's fingers, looking around the kitchen from his new elevation with fresh authority. "There you go," Cole said quietly. It was the voice he used with the horses. Low, no performance in it, just present. "You've got it." Ethan did not have it, technically. He had 2 of Cole's fingers. But he was standing, and he was grinning, and Cole was crouched on the kitchen floor of a ranch he'd built alone, holding a baby upright by 2 fingers. And something about the scene made Eliza's chest ache in a way she didn't have a clean word for. She turned back to the stove. Let them have the moment. The town began in March, not all at once. It started with small things. The way the men at the general store, when Cole went in for supplies, made their conversations quiet when he came through the door. The way Ruth, at the counter, was polite but brief in a way that had a calculation behind it. The way one of the town council members crossed the street when he saw Cole coming. Cole told her about it matter-of-factly, the way he reported anything, without drama, just information. "It's Crowley," she said. "Of course it's Crowley." He was oiling a bridle at the table. "He's been at it since January, working the council, talking to the men who've got land he wants, telling them I've created a situation out here that reflects badly on the valley's reputation. Because of me. That's the handle he's using." He ran the cloth along the leather. "Before you, he'd have found something else. I told you." "I know you told me." She sat down. "Cole, if we went into town together, if people could see that this is a working arrangement and nothing else." "It wouldn't help," he said. "You go to town and they look at you and they see what Crowley told them to see. Doesn't matter what the truth is. She knew he was right. She hated that he was right. So what do we do? He set the bridle down, looked at it, then looked up at her. I've been thinking about that, he said. And? He didn't answer right away, which was his way. He worked something over before he said it, and she'd learned to wait. There are things I could do, he said slowly. Legal things. I've got the land record and the water rights clear and clean. Crowley knows he can't come at me directly on any of that. He paused. But a man's reputation is harder to defend in court, she finished. Yes. He picked up the bridle again. Margaret Pruitt, is she someone you trust? As much as I trust anyone here. There are other women in this valley who think like she does. Quieter about it, because quiet's safer. He turned the bridle over. A person's reputation in a place like this, it's not made by one person. It's made by 30 conversations at 30 different tables. She looked at him. You want me to go into town? I want you to go into town, he said. I want you to drink coffee at Margaret Pruitt's table and at the table of whoever Margaret thinks you should meet next. Not to argue with Crowley's version, just to be, he thought about it, just to be a person, a real person, not the story he's making. She thought about it, thought about the hotel lobby and the general store and the alley behind the saloon where she'd sat on a crate in the cold. It might not work, she said. It might not. He looked at her steadily. But sitting out here and doing nothing is also a choice, and I'm not sure it's better. She sat with that for a moment. I'll write Margaret and ask if I can come by Thursday. Good. He went back to the bridle. Outside the kitchen window, the last of February's snow was going gray at the edges, where the ground was beginning to show through. It wasn't spring yet. It wasn't close to spring. But it was starting to stop being winter, which was its own kind of thing. Eliza watched the gray snow and thought about 30 conversations at 30 different tables, and about reputation, and about how much of a person's life could hinge on what other people decided to believe about them without ever asking. She thought about Crowley, who she'd still never spoken to directly, who existed in her life as a shape of trouble, a voice behind writers and letters and quiet conversations in rooms she wasn't in. She thought, he thinks he's already won. She thought, he hasn't met what we're building yet. She didn't say it out loud. It wasn't the kind of thing she said out loud, but she sat there a while longer than she needed to before she got up and went back to the stove, and whatever was in her face when she turned back around made the pot of stew she stirred more vigorously than strictly necessary. The Thursday visit to Margaret Pruitt's house was not what Eliza had expected, which meant it was better than she'd feared and harder than she'd hoped. Margaret lived on the eastern edge of Blackstone Valley, in a house that was larger than it looked from the road, filled with the kind of organized clutter that meant someone had lived there a long time and stopped apologizing for it. Books stacked on the floor beside shelves that were already full. A quilt frame set up in the corner of the parlor, half finished. A smell of coffee and something baked and wood smoke. It felt like a place that had been inhabited by a real person for real years, and Eliza felt something in her shoulders drop a little when she walked in. Some tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since November. There were 2 other women at the table when she arrived. Margaret had warned her in the return letter. I've asked a couple of people I trust, if you don't mind. And Eliza had decided she didn't mind, or at least that she couldn't afford to. Clara Bemis was the wife of the town blacksmith, a wide-faced woman in her late 30s with calloused hands and a directness that reminded Eliza of herself. Agnes Lowe was older, 60 maybe, with white hair pulled back severe and eyes that didn't miss much. Her husband had died 3 years back and she'd kept the farm going herself, which Eliza only learned later, but which explained something about the way Agnes looked at her, with a recognition she hadn't expected from a stranger. They had coffee. They ate what Margaret had baked, which were dense, good rolls that Eliza ate 2 of and didn't pretend otherwise. Ethan sat in her lap and occasionally attempted to seize whatever was nearest, and they passed him around the table with the comfortable ease of women who'd handled babies before. Nobody brought up Crowley for the first half hour. They talked about the winter, about the cattle losses in the valley, about a dispute over fence lines between 2 ranchers on the south end that apparently had been running for 3 years and had become a kind of sport. Normal conversation. Getting to know you conversation. Eliza told them where she'd come from, what her husband had done, how he'd died, and they listened without visible calculation, which was more than she'd had for most people in this valley. Then Agnes Lowe set down her cup and said, "Wade Crowley told my son-in-law that Cole Mercer has been keeping you out there against your will." The table went quiet. "That's not true," Eliza said. "I know it's not true," Agnes said. "I've known Cole Mercer for 6 years and he doesn't have that in him. But my son-in-law heard it and he's not a smart man and now it's in his head." She looked at Eliza steadily. "I'm telling you so you know how bad it's gotten. How many people have heard something like that?" Agnes and Margaret exchanged a look. "Enough," Margaret said. Clara Bemis was turning her coffee cup in her hands. "Gerald, my husband, he told me last week that the men at the smithy were talking about it. 3, 4 of them. Nobody saying they believed it outright, just wondering." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's how Crowley works. He doesn't say things directly. He just says them until people start wondering." Eliza looked at the table. She thought about the oil lamp in the kitchen at the ranch, about Cole's handwriting on the supply list, about Ethan gripping Cole's 2 fingers and taking his first steps. She thought about how a man could be made into something unrecognizable by the words of someone who'd never been inside his house. "What do people need to see?" she said. "To believe the truth instead of Crowley's version." Margaret refilled her cup. "They need to see you," she said simply. "Both of you. Together, in town, in plain view, being what you actually are instead of what he's saying you are." "We've talked about coming into town more," Eliza said, "but Cole thinks he can outlast it," Agnes said. "He's been doing that for 6 years, outlasting things. It works, mostly." She paused. "But Crowley's smarter this time because he's using something personal, something that people want to have opinions about." Eliza looked at her. "A woman's reputation," she said. "Always the easiest thing to attack," Agnes said, without bitterness. Just the flat acknowledgement of someone who'd been living in the world long enough to have no illusions about it. You can defend land rights in court. You can defend water rights. But you can't make people unwonder something. Clara said, "Unless you give them something real to look at instead." Eliza rode back to the ranch in the afternoon thinking about that. The snow was mostly gone now, the track muddy and soft under the horses' hooves, and the sky had the particular pale quality of early March in high country. Still cold, but with the memory of warmth in it somewhere. She thought about what something real meant, what it looked like from the outside, what Blackstone Valley needed to see that it couldn't dismiss. She didn't have a complete answer when she got back, but she had the shape of one. She didn't bring it up that night. Cole was tired in a way she could read now. The set of his shoulders when he came in from a long day, the extra quiet. And she put supper on the table and didn't push conversation. He ate. She ate. Ethan had been put down early because he'd been fussy all afternoon, some new tooth working its way in, and the house was quieter than usual. Cole poured himself a second cup of coffee, which he didn't normally do, and sat back in his chair. How was Margaret's? She told him most of it. The 2 women she'd met, the general shape of what they'd said, the fact that Crowley had graduated from gossip about her character to something closer to slander about Cole's. She watched his face while she talked. He looked at the table mostly. When she finished, he was quiet for a bit. "The son-in-law story," he said. "That's new." Agnes said she doesn't think her son-in-law will act on it. He's cautious, but she said if Crowley repeats it to the right people, "I know." He turned the cup in his hands. "I know what it becomes." She watched him. He had the look of a man doing a calculation he didn't like the answer to. She'd seen that look before on him, but not quite like this. Not with this particular weight to it. "Cole," she said carefully, "there's something I want to say, and I want you to let me finish before you respond." He looked up. "All right." Margaret and the others, they said what people need is to see something real, something they can look at and understand. She held his gaze. "And I've been thinking about that on the way home, and I think they're right, and I think the only thing that actually changes the story Crowley's telling is—" She stopped, took a breath. "I think the only thing that changes it is if there isn't a story to tell anymore." He was watching her carefully now, with that look he had when he was paying very close attention and not letting it show too much. "If we were married," she said, "the whole thing falls apart. Everything he's built, the gossip, the wondering, the reputation damage, All of it depends on the situation being questionable. Take the question away, and he's got nothing to work with. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not saying it for my sake, she said quickly. Or not only. I'm saying it because Crowley is coming after your land and your livelihood, and he's using me to do it. And I don't want to be the thing he uses. I want to be the thing he can't use. Cole set his cup down. Eliza, I know how it sounds. She did know. She was sitting at a man's kitchen table proposing marriage like a business arrangement, and she was clear-eyed enough to know that was what it was, or what it started as, and she wasn't going to dress it up. I'm not asking for anything more than what we already have. What we have works. You know that, and I know that. But if it had a legal structure, if we stood up in front of this valley and made it official, it removes the weapon he's using. Cole was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated badly. Then he said, There's something I need to say. All right. He looked at the table. This was harder for him than the way he talked about horses, about land, about supply lists. She could see him working to find the right words and not quite getting to them, settling for the next closest thing. What we have here, he said finally. I didn't expect this. When I brought you out from town, I was thinking about what was right to do. I wasn't thinking further than that. A pause. But the last 4 months have been... He stopped again. I'm not good at saying things. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to be. What I mean is, he looked up. His face had something in it she hadn't seen on him before. The particular vulnerability of a man who has been alone long enough that being seen feels like standing in open ground. It wouldn't only be about the legal structure. For me. I want you to know that. She looked at him. The lamp between them was burning low and throwing warm light on the side of his face, and the tired, honest way he was sitting there trying to say something real without the words coming easily. I know, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. And Ethan, he said, if we did this, I'd want to claim him, properly, not just on paper, as mine. She hadn't expected that part. She'd thought about the legal weight of it, about Crowley and the valley and the stories going around at tables she wasn't sitting at. She hadn't thought about Ethan, about what it would mean to Ethan to have a name and a father who'd chosen him deliberately, out loud, in front of everyone. Her throat did something inconvenient. That would mean a great deal, she said carefully. To both of us. Cole nodded. He looked at the table again. I'm not a man who's easy to live with. I know that. I'm quiet, and I'm set in my ways, and I have a temper I work to keep down, and there are days I'm not fit company. You've been fit company so far. I've been on my best behavior, he said, which was so unexpected coming from him that she almost laughed. Have you? She said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. Mostly. She looked at him across the table, this man she'd known for 4 months, who had crouched on her kitchen floor to hold her son's fingers so he could stand upright for the first time, who had written thread on a supply list and gotten it, who had looked at a crowd of people choosing cruelty by inaction and chosen differently. Then yes, she said. If you're asking, I'm asking. Yes. They told Margaret first, which was practical. They needed a witness and someone to arrange the justice of the peace, who was a man named Aldous Kearney that Margaret knew and trusted. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of March in the Pruitt parlor, with no announcement made in advance and no invitation extended to anyone they didn't trust. The week before it, Crowley found out anyway. Eliza never knew exactly how. This valley had ears she hadn't mapped yet, but 3 days before the Saturday, another rider came down the north track. This time it wasn't Hendricks. This time it was Crowley himself. She saw him coming from the kitchen window and felt the particular cold that wasn't from the weather. He was exactly as she'd reconstructed him from descriptions and that one evening in November, heavy-set, well-dressed for the territory, with the watch chain and the bearing of a man accustomed to arriving places and having the shape of the conversation change when he did. He pulled up at the gate on a roan horse and looked at the house with the unhurried confidence of someone who hadn't yet lost anything he'd gone after. Cole was in the barn. She went to the porch. Mrs. Hartwell, Crowley said. He said it pleasantly, which was worse than if he hadn't. Is Cole in? He's in the barn, she said. I'll get him. No need to trouble yourself. He stayed on the horse, a choice that was about height and position, and both of them knew it. I'll wait. She didn't go back inside. She stood on the porch and waited too, and they looked at each other across the gate with the clear-eyed mutual assessment of two people who had been on opposite sides of something for months and were finally in the same place. I've heard congratulations may be in order, Crowley said. You heard right. He smiled and it almost reached his eyes. Well, that's a practical solution to a practical problem. I respect practicality. He settled in the saddle. Though I'll say Cole's waited long enough to complicate things further. I don't know what you mean, she said, because making him say things directly was the only small power available to her right now, and she was going to use it. I mean, he said patiently, that the situation was already delicate, and adding a legal arrangement now doesn't change the nature of what's been going on out here for 4 months. The nature of what's been going on, she said, is that I've been cooking and cleaning and keeping this ranch running while Cole manages 30 horses. You're welcome to come in and inspect the kitchen if you have doubts. Something in his face tightened briefly. Then the pleasantness came back. You're a smart woman, he said. I'll give you that. Thank you. Smart enough to know that a marriage license doesn't change how people think. The Valley's already got its opinion. The Valley's opinion changes, she said. I've seen it change already. Margaret Pruitt's table isn't as small as it used to be. That one landed. She could see it, just barely. The slight recalculation, the reweighing. Cole came out of the barn at that point, saw Crowley at the gate, and crossed the yard with the unhurried walk he had that never looked slow but covered ground efficiently. He stopped at the gate but didn't open it. Wade, he said. Cole. Crowley looked at him with something between respect and the specific kind of regard one opponent has for another. I heard the news, wanted to offer my congratulations in person. That's generous of you. I also wanted to talk about the land. He said it directly, which Eliza had come to understand was his mode when pleasantness wasn't producing results. My offer still stands. I've increased it. He named a number that was higher than the previous letters. Not by much, but enough to be noticed. Cole stood at the gate. No, he said. Cole, think about what you're starting here. A wife, a child, a ranch that barely turns profit in good years. If the winter hadn't been as bad, the ranch will turn profit when I'm done building it, Cole said. That's been the plan since I started. And if the Valley's opinion of your household makes it hard to do business here, if nobody wants to buy horses from a man whose situation is... I'd watch how I finish that sentence, Cole said. His voice hadn't changed tone, which somehow made it more effective than if he'd gotten loud. That's my wife you're talking about. Crowley was quiet for a moment. My offer is declined. Cole put one hand on the gate. You've come out here, which I appreciate, because now I can say this directly instead of through Hendricks. I'm not selling. I'm not going to sell. If the railroad comes through this valley, I'll negotiate right of way with the railroad company and not with you. And if you have more things to say about my family's character in this valley, I'll be consulting a lawyer about what can be done about that. A pause. Aldous Kearney, as it happens, has a brother-in-law in territorial law. Margaret Pruitt thought I should know that. Something moved across Crowley's face that wasn't the pleasantness. It was quick, and then it was gone, and the pleasantness came back, but it was thinner than before. You've thought this through, he said. I have a lot of time to think, Cole said. 12 miles from town. Crowley looked at him, looked at Eliza on the porch, looked at the ranch, the barn, the fence lines, the land that sat exactly where he needed it to sit. I'll be honest with you, Cole, he said finally, in the tone that meant he was going to be anything but. I respect your position. I even respect the stubbornness of it, but stubbornness has a cost in a community, and you're going to find that out. I already know the cost, Cole said. I've been paying it. Crowley touched his hat. The gesture she was learning that meant a conversation was over on his terms, even when it wasn't. He turned his horse and went back down the track without hurrying. Cole stood at the gate, watching until the horse was out of sight. Then he turned around, came up the porch steps, and stopped next to her. They stood there for a moment without speaking. Margaret mentioned Kearney's brother-in-law to you, she said. Last week, when I rode over to ask about the JP, you didn't tell me. Didn't know if it would come to anything. He looked at the empty track. Now it might. She nodded. He's not done, she said. No. He opened the door. He's not done, but he's... He paused in the doorway, thinking about it. He came himself. He hasn't done that before. That means something's shifted and he's not sure what to do about it yet. She thought about that. Good, she said. Good, he agreed and went inside. The wedding was on a Saturday morning with rain threatening from the west and not quite arriving. Margaret's parlor held 8 people. Margaret and her husband Thomas, Agnes Lowe, Clara Bemis, and her husband Gerald, a man named Peters who ran the feed store and had been, Margaret said quietly, pulling away from Crowley's orbit for months now, over something that wasn't anyone's business, but apparently involved a loan and a piece of ground. And Aldous Kearney, the JP, who was 60-ish and methodical, and read the ceremony from a worn document with the same care he'd probably applied to every legal proceeding he'd ever overseen. Eliza wore her better dress, the dark blue one she'd been saving without knowing what for. She'd done her hair in the morning with more care than usual, and Ethan had immediately pulled half of it down, which was why one side was neater than the other when she stood in Margaret's parlor. She'd decided not to fix it again. It seemed like the right approach to the day. Cole had shaved, which was notable. He wore a clean shirt and his good coat and had done something with his hair that made it look like he'd thought about it, and he stood next to her in front of Kearney with the slightly rigid posture of a man doing something significant and feeling the weight of it. When Kearney asked the questions, they both said yes clearly. There was no trembling in Eliza's voice because she'd already been through her feelings about this in private, where they belonged, and what came out in public was just the steady part. Cole's voice was even, the way it always was, but his hand when he took hers was not entirely steady, and she felt that and didn't say anything about it. Kearney wrote in the book. Both of them signed it. Kearney signed it. Thomas Pruitt and Peters witnessed it. That was the legal part. The part that stayed with her was what Cole said to Ethan. He'd picked him up after the signing. Ethan had been passed among the women during the ceremony and had behaved with extraordinary cooperation for a 9-month-old, which she suspected was the novelty of the new faces. And Cole held him and looked at him, and then said, quiet enough that only Eliza and maybe Margaret heard it, "You're mine now, officially, in case you had any doubts." Ethan grabbed Cole's collar and said something that wasn't a word yet, but had the confidence of one. "Yeah," Cole said. "That's what I thought." Margaret had coffee and the dense rolls from the first visit, and they sat around her table and it felt, for the first time in months, like something that was simply good without requiring any work to be good. Gerald Bemis and Cole talked horses. Agnes Lowe told Eliza something about the valley's history that she needed to know. Who had been here long, who was recent, who Crowley had managed and who he hadn't, and why. Peters, who turned out to be a quieter version of useful, mentioned that there was talk among some of the landowners on the south end about the railroad survey and what Crowley might or might not have told them about which way the line would run. "What do you mean, what he told them?" Eliza said. Peters turned his coffee cup. "Well, there's the survey the railroad actually did, and there's what Crowley's been telling people the survey said." He glanced at Cole. "They're not the same thing from what I can gather." Cole set his cup down carefully. "Explain that." "Can't give you specifics, but I know a man who knows a man who works for the railroad company, and the story I've heard is that the line isn't definitely coming through the valley. There are 2 routes still under consideration. Crowley's been acting like it's settled, and the valley route is chosen, but it may not be settled." The table got quiet. "If the valley route isn't chosen," Cole said slowly, "then Crowley spent 2 years buying up land that doesn't get the railroad premium." "That's about the size of it," Peter said. Eliza looked at Cole. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man seeing something rearrange itself, not with satisfaction yet, more with the careful attention of someone who didn't want to assume anything before the shape of it was clear. "Who knows this?" he said to Peters. "Me. Now you. Whoever the man told who told me." He shrugged. "Rumors travel, but slowly when they go against what people want to believe." "People want to believe the railroad's coming," Eliza said. "Of course they do. It means money. Everybody wants it to be true." Peters spread his hands. "Crowley's been the one saying it's definitely true. If he turns out to be wrong..." Or if he knew and didn't say. Then the trust is gone, Agnes said from the other end of the table. And Crowley's built everything here on being the man who knows what's coming. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the rain that had been threatening finally made up its mind and started, soft at first, then steadier, working against the window with the sound of something persistent. Cole looked at Eliza. A long look, private in the way that looks between two people can be even in a room full of others. She looked back, said nothing, didn't need to. The ride home that afternoon was quieter than the ride to town months ago. Different kind of quiet. Ethan was against her in the sling she'd made for him, almost asleep, and the rain had stopped and left the air clean and cold and smelling of thawed earth. Cole rode alongside her instead of ahead, which he'd started doing sometime in February without commenting on it. "Peters," she said after a while. "I know. If the railroad information is true, we don't know that it is. Peters got it third hand. But if it is," she pressed. He was quiet for a moment. "If it is, then everything Crowley's been doing in this valley for 2 years has been based on information he either had wrong or had right and didn't share." He looked at the track ahead. "Either way, it changes things." "What do we do?" "Nothing yet. We get home. We think about it." A pause. "I might write to the railroad company directly. Inquire about the survey. A landowner has standing to ask." "Aldous Kearney's brother-in-law in territorial law," she said. He looked over at her briefly. "You remembered that." "I remember useful things." They rode. The light was going amber and low, the way it does in late March when the day runs longer than it used to and the change feels recent enough to still be surprising. The ranch came into view from the high point of the track. The house, the barn, the fence lines, the horses moving in the far pasture. Eliza had stopped thinking of it as his ranch sometime in February. She wasn't sure when exactly. The shift had been gradual, the way most real things are. "Cole," she said. "What you said to Ethan, in the parlor." He didn't answer right away. It needed saying. "Yes." She looked at the side of his face. "Thank you." He nodded once. The road was getting easier to navigate now. The mud had dried in the afternoon while they were at Margaret's, and the horse moved with more confidence. "You think Crowley's going to come back with something else?" she said. It wasn't a question. "He won't just stop," Cole said. "He's not the kind of man who stops. He'll find another angle." His jaw worked. "But the angles are getting fewer. What was left, do you think, before we did this?" He considered it. "The story about your character, my character, the isolation, keeping you out here, away from town, which he's been calling suspicious." He looked ahead. "All of that just..." He shook his head slightly. "There's nothing to work with if we're a legal family. It's harder to make something out of nothing when there's a record in Aldous Kearney's book." "He'll try anyway," she said. "He'll try anyway," Cole agreed. "But trying and succeeding aren't the same thing. They haven't been the same thing for him since about January." Something in his voice, not satisfaction, not quite. More like the grim, quiet confidence of a man who'd been holding a position under fire and could feel it starting to hold. Ethan made a sound in his sleep, the small sound of a baby dreaming, content and deep. And Cole glanced down at him and then looked away, back at the road. But she saw it. She always saw it. They reached the ranch as the last of the light went out of the sky, and Cole got down first and held the horse while she dismounted with Ethan. And when she straightened up, they were standing close, closer than the distance they'd maintained for 4 months, something having shifted the geometry between them without being announced. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He took the horse toward the barn. She carried Ethan inside, got the fire going, started supper. The house had the same sounds it always had. The wind, the horses, the fire catching. But they sat in a slightly different configuration now. Those sounds, like a song she'd been hearing for months, had added one more note that made the whole thing finally resolve. She didn't know what Crowley was going to do next. She didn't know what the railroad survey would say, or what Peters's third-hand information was worth, or how long it would take for the valley's opinion to finish its slow turn. There were things she couldn't know yet, and she was practiced enough at living her life to understand that not knowing wasn't the same as losing. She put water on for coffee, checked on Ethan where she'd laid him, listened to the sound of Cole coming back from the barn. Boots on the step, the door, the familiar sounds of him moving through the house's edges before coming to the kitchen. What she had was this, a legal record in a JP's book, a child with a father's name now, and 30 horses in the pasture belonging to a man who'd been asked to leave and had said no every time. That was not nothing. That was, she was beginning to understand, quite a lot. The letter from the railroad company came on a Wednesday in late April, and Cole read it twice at the kitchen table before he put it down. Eliza was at the stove. She heard him set the paper down and turned around. His face told her enough. Good or bad? She said. Interesting, he said. She dried her hands and came to the table, and he pushed the letter toward her. It was 2 pages, written in the careful bureaucratic language of a company that dealt in large sums of money and had learned to say things precisely to avoid being held to anything they didn't mean. She read it slowly. The railroad had, in fact, commissioned 2 surveys, one for the valley route through Blackstone, one for the ridge route that climbed higher and required more construction but bypassed the valley entirely. The letter didn't say which route had been chosen. What it said, in response to Cole's inquiry about right-of-way negotiation for his specific parcel, was that the company would be in contact with landowners along the selected corridor by the end of summer, and that his parcel was located within the survey boundaries of one of the 2 routes under consideration. Peters had been right about one thing. It wasn't settled. He's been telling people it's coming through the valley, Eliza said. For 2 years, Cole said. That's what got people to sell. That's what got the Dillards out. The errands. Every parcel he bought with the valley route as a given. He tapped the letter. This says it's not a given. Does he know? She said. Has he seen this kind of letter? He should have. If he wrote to them, which a man in his position would do, Cole stopped, looked at the letter again. If he wrote to them and got an answer like this and then kept telling people the valley route was certain, then he lied to get them to sell cheap, Eliza said. The words sat between them, plain and heavy. That's fraud, she said. It might be. He stood up. I need to talk to Kearney. Today? Tomorrow. He picked up the letter. I want to think about it overnight. Make sure I'm reading it right and not seeing what I want to see. That was Cole. That was something she'd come to recognize and rely on in him, that insistence on slowing down before conclusions. Other men would have saddled up immediately. He sat back down, put the letter on the table between them, and they both looked at it like it was an animal that needed to be understood before it was handled. Even if it's fraud, she said, thinking out loud. Proving it means showing he knew the route wasn't decided when he was saying it was. That's not easy. No, he agreed, but it's something a lawyer can look at. And even if it can't be proven to a legal standard, he paused. If people in this valley know what this letter says, if they know the valley route isn't certain, if they start asking Crowley directly why he told them different, the trust breaks, she said. She'd heard Agnes say it 2 months ago at Margaret's table. Crowley's built everything here on being the man who knows what's coming. Yes, Cole said. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd been married to for 4 weeks who still sometimes surprised her with how carefully he thought. You've been waiting for something like this, she said. I've been hoping for something like this, he corrected. Waiting implies I was sure it would come. I wasn't. But you wrote to the railroad anyway. Peter said enough that I thought it was worth asking. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. It may come to nothing. I want to be clear about that. I know. She went back to the stove. But it might not come to nothing. It might not, he said, and for Cole Mercer, that qualified as optimism. Aldous Kearney's office was a room above the feed store that smelled like old paper and boot leather, and the man himself was at his desk when Cole and Eliza arrived Thursday morning with Ethan and the letter. Kearney read it the same way Cole had, twice, without speaking, with the methodical attention of a man who'd spent 40 years making sure he understood what he was actually reading before he said anything about it. Then he set it down and looked at them over his glasses. You wrote to them in April, he said to Cole. 3rd week. And you got this response in what, 10 days? 12. Kearney nodded slowly. That's faster than I'd expect for a routine inquiry. He looked at the letter again. which suggests the question you asked about right-of-way on your specific parcel was a question they were prepared to answer quickly, which suggests your parcel is on their active list for one of the routes. That's how I read it, Cole said. My brother-in-law might read it differently. He's more familiar with railroad law than I am. Kearney put his glasses on the desk. But I'll say this. The part that interests me is what it implies about what Crowley has or hasn't been telling people. He folded his hands. You can't sue a man for optimism. You can't take him to court for saying he believed the valley route was coming when maybe he was just wrong. He paused. But if he had access to the same kind of information you just received, if he wrote to this company and got a similar answer, and then told people it was certain when the letter said it wasn't, is that provable? Eliza asked. Not easily, and maybe not at all, depending on what his letter said and whether he kept it. Kearney tapped the desk. But here's the thing that matters practically. You don't necessarily need to prove it in court to change the situation in this valley. Cole looked at him. Explain that. People out here don't need a verdict to change their opinion. They need information and a reason to reconsider. Kearney leaned back. If it became known, through normal conversation, through people asking sensible questions, that the railroad route was not settled when Crowley said it was, some of the men he's sold that certainty to would start looking at him differently. He looked at the letter. May I keep this for a few days? Show my brother-in-law? Yes, Cole said. Good. Kearney picked up the letter. In the meantime, you're not in a hurry to publicize this? I want to understand what I have before I use it, Cole said. Kearney smiled briefly, which was apparently rare enough that it changed his face noticeably. That's sensible. He stood up, which meant the meeting was done. Congratulations, by the way, on the marriage. Overdue, in my opinion, though I didn't say that. Appreciated, Cole said. They were at the door when Kearney said, Cole. They both turned. Crowley's going to find out you came to see me. He has ears in this building. He looked at Cole steadily. Be ready for him to move faster than he has been. I've been ready, Cole said. They went downstairs. On the street outside the feed store, Eliza shifted Ethan on her hip and looked at the main street of Blackstone Valley, which was going about its Wednesday morning business. A wagon at the general store, 2 men in conversation outside the livery, a woman she recognized as Clara Bemis crossing toward the dry goods with a basket. Clara saw her and waved, an ordinary wave, comfortable and unguarded. Eliza waved back. 4 months ago, she'd been in an alley behind the saloon, eating crackers in the cold. She stood in the same street now, as a woman with a name and a legal address, and a JP's record, and a wave from someone who knew her. And the difference between those 2 versions of standing in the same street was enormous and quiet, and something she was still learning to locate inside herself. Coffee before we go back? Cole said. Margaret's? I was thinking the hotel dining room, he said. She looked at him. The hotel, where the man at the desk had told her they were full with no one in the lobby. All right, she said. You don't have to. I said all right, she said. Let's go. The man at the hotel desk was the same man. He looked up when they came in, looked at Cole, looked at Eliza, looked at Ethan, and did the calculation she could see him doing. But it was a different calculation this time, with different variables. Cole Mercer was known in this valley. Cole Mercer's wife, who was standing next to him with a baby on her hip, was a different legal and social fact than the woman who'd been standing alone 4 months ago. Morning, Cole said. 2 coffees in the dining room. Of course, the man said. Just like that. Of course. She didn't say anything while they walked into the dining room and sat at a table by the window. Cole poured cream into his coffee, and she looked out at the street and thought about how much of a person's life was determined by what category other people put them in, and how little of it had to do with who they actually were. You all right? Cole said. Fine, she said. Just thinking. About what? About how much easier everything is when you have someone standing next to you. She looked at him. I don't mean that as a complaint about before. I managed before. I know you managed. I just mean, she looked at the street. It's different. Having someone in your corner changes what's possible, even practically, just walking into a room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know that too, from the other direction. She looked at him. I managed alone for 6 years, he said. I wasn't I didn't think I needed. He stopped, looked at his coffee. Ethan walked to me in the kitchen in February because I was there and he wanted to get somewhere. That's a small thing. It's not a small thing, she said. No, he said. It's not. He drank his coffee. I'm not good at saying what I mean. You're better than you think, she said. He looked up, and she held his gaze, and for a moment something was just present between them. Nothing performed about it, nothing dressed up. Just two people who'd come at a hard life from different angles and ended up at the same table, and meant it. Ethan grabbed the edge of the table and made his opinion about the coffee known by trying to reach for Cole's cup. No, Cole told him, and moved the cup. Ethan looked outraged. Cole gave him a spoon instead. Ethan accepted this as a reasonable compromise and began hitting the table with it rhythmically. The dining room didn't empty out. Nobody told them to leave. Hut. Crowley moved in May, but not the way Cole had expected. Instead of another writer, instead of another offer, instead of the whisper campaign, he went to the town council directly and proposed a formal resolution, a community standards ordinance that would give the council authority to regulate who could operate a business in Blackstone Valley. The language was careful, the kind of language that sounds neutral until you read it twice, and then you could see exactly what it was built to do. Peters brought them the news on a Saturday, riding out to the ranch with the information and the expression of a man who'd decided which side he was on and was done pretending otherwise. It's aimed at you, he told Cole, at the kitchen table, while Eliza poured coffee and listened. At the horse operation, the language is broad enough that if they pass it and Crowley gets to apply it, he could find reasons to shut down your sales. Call it a licensing issue, a community standards issue, whatever he needs. Cole's jaw was tight. Who on the council is backing it? Harmon and Bell for sure. Harmon owes Crowley money, which everyone knows. Bell goes where it looks like power is. Peters wrapped his hands around the cup. Turner is a maybe. The other two, Weston and Davies, I don't think they're with him. But if he gets 3 votes... What's the timeline? Cole said. Council meets first Monday of June. That's 3 weeks. Cole looked at Eliza. She was already thinking. 3 weeks, she said. Turner is the swing vote. Probably, Peters said. Does Turner know about the railroad letter? Peters looked at her. No. He should. She looked at Cole. All of them should. But Turner especially, if he's deciding. That's using it before Kearney's brother-in-law has looked at it, Cole said. I know. She set her cup down. But if this ordinance passes, it's harder to fight what comes after. Better to use what we have now than wait for a perfect moment that might not come. Cole looked at Peters. Turner, what's he care about? His family's been in this valley 12 years. He's got 2 sons farming south of town. He cares about whether the valley gets the railroad. Peters paused. He really believes Crowley's been straight about the route. And if he stops believing that, Eliza said, he's got reason to ask why Crowley needs this ordinance so badly. Might be enough to get him to abstain at least, Peters said, which effectively kills it if Harmon and Bell are the only ones voting yes. Cole sat back. How do we get the letter in front of Turner without it looking like we're running a campaign against Crowley? You let me do it, Peters said. They both looked at him. I'm a businessman, Peters said. Crowley's never owned me, which he knows, which is why he's never quite trusted me. But I'm not his enemy either. I've been careful. He shrugged. Turner drinks coffee at my store every Tuesday. I can have a conversation. Show him the letter as something I came across. Ask him what he makes of it. You do that? Cole said. Peters looked slightly annoyed. I run a feed store in a valley he's trying to turn into his private property. Yes, I do that. He drank his coffee. I'm not doing it for you specifically. I'm doing it because I'd like to be able to run my store without asking Wade Crowley's permission. Fair enough, Cole said. The Tuesday before the council meeting, Margaret came out to the ranch again, this time with Agnes Lowe in tow, and the 4 of them sat at the kitchen table while Ethan slept and talked through what they knew and didn't know. Turner had, according to Peters, received the information about the railroad letter with what Peters described as careful attention, the face of a man who was recalculating something significant and not happy about what the new numbers said. Turner had not committed to anything, but he'd asked Peters 3 follow-up questions, which Peters took as a good sign, and he'd been notably absent from the conversation at the barber shop on Thursday, where Crowley's men had been making the rounds. Absence is something, Agnes said. It's not a vote, Cole said. No, Agnes agreed, but a man who's decided to vote yes doesn't make himself hard to find. Margaret had other news, which she delivered with the careful neutrality of someone reporting facts she found distasteful. Crowley's been saying the marriage was arranged specifically to block his offer. She glanced at Eliza. That the whole thing was a legal maneuver, not a real marriage. It was both, Eliza said. The table went slightly quiet. I'm not going to pretend the timing was coincidence because it wasn't entirely. But I'm also not going to pretend the rest of it isn't real because it is. She looked at her hands on the table. People can decide what they want to believe about the reasons. What they can see is the result. Agnes looked at her with the recognition Eliza had noticed the first time they'd met. What people can see, she said, is that you're still here. 4 months after you arrived with nothing and a baby in the cold, you're still here and you haven't run, and the ranch is running better than it was. She looked at Cole. That's not a legal maneuver. That's a life. Cole said nothing. But something in his face shifted the way it did when something had landed accurately. The ordinance meeting, Eliza said. Can we be there? It's an open council meeting, Margaret said. Anyone can attend. Then we go. Cole looked at her. Crowley will be there. Good, she said. The first Monday of June came in warm and clear, which seemed like the wrong weather for what it was. They rode into town in the morning, Cole, Eliza, Ethan, with the particular efficiency of a family that had gotten good at moving together. The council room was above the post office, a low-ceilinged space with 4 rows of benches that filled up by the time the meeting started. Eliza had expected perhaps 20 people. There were closer to 40. Some she knew: Margaret, Agnes, Clara, and Gerald Bemis, Peters. Many she didn't. All of them had come because something was happening in the valley, and people came when something was happening. Crowley was there near the front, in his good coat with Hendricks 2 seats behind him. He saw Cole and Eliza come in, and his face did the thing it did, the pleasantness that was really a calculation. And he nodded at Cole, who nodded back, and they found seats on opposite sides of the room like the poles of something. The council sat at a table at the front: Harmon, Bell, Turner, Weston, Davies. 5 men who ranged from comfortable to sweating. Harmon was the one sweating. The council chairman, Weston, called the meeting. He was a thin, precise man who'd been running these meetings long enough to be good at keeping them from running off into chaos, though this one, Eliza could feel, was going to test that skill. Crowley presented the ordinance himself, standing at the front of the room with the confidence of a man who'd been in front of audiences before. He made it sound reasonable: community standards, accountability, ensuring that commercial operations in the valley met the expectations of residents. He didn't say Cole's name. He didn't have to. The room knew whose operations he was talking about, and from the shifting on the benches, the room had opinions about that. When he finished, Weston opened the floor. Peter stood up first. He had, Eliza realized, probably planned to be first. I'd like to ask Mr. Crowley a question, Peter said, about the railroad. The room shifted. Crowley's face stayed pleasant. Of course. You've been telling landowners in this valley for 2 years that the railroad line is coming through the valley, that the route is settled. Peters held up a letter, not Cole's letter, but a copy he'd made, which Kearney's brother-in-law had confirmed was accurate in its reading. I have here a letter from the railroad company to a landowner in this valley, written 6 weeks ago, which says the route is not settled, that there are 2 routes still under consideration. He looked at Crowley. Did you know that when you were telling people the valley route was certain? The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something real has just happened. Crowley looked at Peters with the pleasantness fully operational. Survey information changes as projects develop, he said. My understanding at the time. What was your understanding? Peters said. And when did you have it? I don't think this is relevant to the ordinance before the council, Crowley said, turning to Weston. I think it's relevant to whether we trust the man proposing the ordinance, said a voice from the benches. It was Gerald Bemis, not a man who spoke at public meetings, apparently, because several heads turned in surprise. Gerald looked slightly surprised himself that he'd said it, but he didn't sit back down. Harmon said something to Bell in a low voice. Bell looked at his hands. Turner, at the council table, was looking at Crowley with an expression that had changed from the one he'd worn when the meeting started. Eliza watched him and thought, Peters did his job. Weston said, Mr. Crowley, do you have documentation of your representations to landowners regarding the railroad survey? I have notes, Crowley said, nothing formal. And the landowners who sold to you, were they given the same letter that Mr. Peters has referenced? The letter indicating the route was not settled. I don't believe that letter was available when those transactions occurred. Was information equivalent to it available to you? Weston pressed. Crowley looked at Weston, and something in his face, something behind the pleasantness, underneath the watch chain and the bearing, went briefly uncertain, like a floor showing a soft spot. I'd want to consult with my records before answering that definitively, he said. I'll bet you would, said someone from the back. Eliza didn't see who. There was a sound from the benches, not laughter, but its near relation. Crowley turned to address the room. I understand there are questions, and I'm happy to address them in an appropriate setting. But we're here today to talk about community standards in this valley, and I think we should stay on that topic. Why do you need this ordinance? Cole said. He hadn't stood up. He was still sitting, which somehow made it more effective. The question came from the benches, from a man sitting among his neighbors, not a man making a presentation. The room turned toward him. Why does Blackstone Valley need a commercial standards ordinance that doesn't currently exist and hasn't been needed for the 12 years this valley has been settled? Cole looked at the council, not at Crowley. What has changed that makes this necessary now? I'd like the council to answer that, since they're the ones who'd be voting on it. Harmon looked at the table. Bell looked at Harmon. Turner looked at Cole. Mr. Mercer, Turner said slowly, what's your understanding of the railroad situation? Based on the letter you received? My understanding, Cole said, is that the valley route is one of two options, and neither has been chosen. I'd be happy to provide the original letter to the council for review, if that's useful. Turner looked at Crowley. Mr. Crowley, did you receive similar information at any point in the last 2 years? The room was very quiet. Crowley stood at the front of it, and for the first time since Eliza had encountered him, in the street that November night, through Hendricks and letters and riders and the long machinery of what he'd been doing to them, he looked like a man who'd run out of road. He didn't answer Turner's question, not directly. He said something about the complexity of railroad communications, about how information from surveys was often preliminary and subject to change, about how he'd acted in good faith based on his best understanding. It was a careful non-answer, and everyone in the room could hear that it was a non-answer, which was itself an answer. Harmon, who had been sweating since the meeting started, raised his hand and said he thought the ordinance vote should be tabled pending further review. Bell agreed with Harmon, which was apparently what Bell did. Turner said he seconded the motion to table. The ordinance died without a vote. Crowley didn't leave immediately after the meeting. He stood near the front of the room while people filed out, and he had conversations, the watch chain, the pleasant face, the adjustments happening behind his eyes. But the conversations were shorter than they'd have been an hour ago. People moved through them and kept moving. Eliza and Cole were near the back of the room when Crowley made his way over to them, which he did. She'd thought he might avoid it, but he wasn't that kind of man. He came over and he stood in front of them, and for a moment nobody said anything. That was well done, Crowley said finally. He looked at Cole, then at Eliza, and it was clear he was including both of them in the assessment. The letter, Peters, the timing. It wasn't strategy, Cole said. I wrote to the railroad because I had a right to know about my land. Peters showed the letter because he thought people should know. Everything's strategy, Crowley said. He said it without rancor, like it was just an observation about how the world worked. Then maybe your strategy had a flaw in it, Eliza said. You built everything on information that wasn't as solid as you said it was. And you built a reputation on that information. That's not a problem someone else created for you. Crowley looked at her. She met his gaze and didn't look away, which she could feel took something even now, even after months of practice at not looking away from hard things. You're going to do well here, he said to her. He said it like he was giving her something, and she took it as he meant it. Not as a compliment, but as a capitulation dressed up as one. I know, she said. He nodded, looked at Ethan, who was on Cole's hip now, and regarding Crowley with the serious examination he gave all unfamiliar adults. Then he put his hat on and walked toward the door. Cole watched him go. Eliza watched Cole watching. "Is that it?" she said quietly. "No," Cole said. "He'll do something else. Men like that always do something else." "But smaller," she said. "But smaller," he agreed. They walked out into the June morning, into a main street that was going about its ordinary business, and the sun was the kind of warm that had actual intention behind it, not the thin winter kind that promised more than it delivered. Ethan squinted up at it and made a sound that was somewhere between complaint and wonder. Peters was outside, talking to Agnes Lowe and Margaret, and he looked over at Cole with the expression of a man who'd done the thing and was done talking about doing the thing. Cole walked over and shook his hand. Peters nodded. That was apparently enough. Margaret came to Eliza and said, "How are you?" "Good," Eliza said, and meant it. "You handled that well in there, both of you." "It wasn't. We just said what was true," Eliza said. "That's usually enough," Agnes said from beside Margaret. "The problem is most people don't bother." She looked at the street, at the departing council members, at the ordinary morning reconstituting itself around them. "Crowley's going to have a hard few months. That railroad question isn't going to go away. Every man he sold land to cheap is going to start wondering what they were told and whether it was accurate." "Can they do anything about it legally?" Eliza asked. "That's what lawyers figure out." Agnes shrugged. "But even if they can't, trust is harder to rebuild than a fence line. He might come out of this with his money and his land and no way to do what he was doing before, because nobody's going to sell him anything or follow his lead on anything without asking twice." Eliza thought about the Dillard family and the Aarons and whoever else had sold cheap and moved on based on what Crowley had told them. She felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. Too many people had been hurt for satisfaction to be the right word. More like the specific relief of a wrong thing stopping. She looked at Cole, who was still talking with Peters, Ethan on his hip, Ethan's hand gripping the lapel of Cole's coat with the proprietary confidence of a child who knew exactly whose coat it was. Agnes followed her gaze. "He's been different this year," she said. "Different how?" "Less alone-looking," Agnes said simply. "He always had a settled quality, but settled and alone is just another word for waiting." She looked at Eliza. "He stopped looking like he was waiting." Eliza didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, and Agnes didn't seem to need her to. They rode home in the early afternoon, the three of them on the track that Eliza knew now the way she knew the kitchen floor, where it was firm, where it went soft, where you had to adjust your angle. Ethan fell asleep between them almost immediately, the way he did when he'd had enough stimulus and needed to process it. The ranch came into view from the high point of the track. The house, the barn, the horses in the pasture. 34 horses now. Cole had bought 4 in May, good stock, the kind of investment that meant he was building toward something rather than just maintaining. "Turner," she said, "after today, is he with us?" "He's not against us," Cole said. "That's probably the best version of with us we'll get from Turner for a while. But it's enough? For now." He looked at the horses in the pasture. "Crowley still has land in this valley. He's not gone, but He paused. "He's got different problems than he had this morning." "And we have different problems than we had this morning," she said. "Fewer," he said, "and smaller." She thought about November. The wagon, the mud, the hotel lobby, the cold alley, the 18 miles to the next town that she'd been calculating how to manage, the $19. All of it had been so close to ending her in a particular way, the way that doesn't kill you but leaves you somewhere smaller than you were. She looked at Cole riding beside her, at his profile against the afternoon sky, at the way he held Ethan against him, even in sleep with the unconscious ease of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like not to. She didn't say any of what she was thinking. It was too large for what words could do to it, and it wasn't the kind of thing that needed saying between them anymore. He knew. She knew he knew. The ranch gate came into view, and Cole reached over and opened it without getting down, the way he'd learned to do it, the way that took a certain angle and reach that he'd figured out through trial and error one afternoon in January and never had to think about again. She rode through. He followed. The gate swung shut behind them. Ethan slept on, indifferent to gates and land rights and the small reversals of powerful men, dreaming whatever it was that children dreamed when they had enough to eat and somewhere warm to sleep and arms they recognized holding them up. The horses in the pasture moved along the fence as they came in, interested and unhurried, the way animals are when they know the people coming toward them and have no reason to be anything but calm. The summer after the council meeting was the first one Eliza didn't spend bracing for something. That took getting used to. She'd lived in a state of low-level readiness for so long, through the last months of her husband's illness, through the early weeks of Ethan's life, through Missouri and the wagon and the cold alley and the whole first winter at the ranch, that the absence of immediate threat felt less like peace and more like a silence she kept expecting to be broken. She'd wake some mornings in the gray before dawn and lie there waiting for the thing that was coming, and then remember slowly that the thing that had been coming had mostly arrived and mostly passed, and the day ahead was just a day. It took her until July to stop waiting. Cole noticed before she said anything, which was typical of him. He noticed things and didn't comment on them until he decided the comment would be useful. One evening in late June, he came in from the barn and found her standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, looking at nothing in particular, and he said, "You doing all right?" "Fine," she said. "You've said fine about 40 times this month." She turned around. He was at the sink washing his hands, not looking at her, which was sometimes how he had the most honest conversations, facing away, so neither of them had to perform anything with their faces. "I keep waiting for the next thing," she said. "The next thing from Crowley?" "From anything." She set the cold coffee down. "I'm not used to it being—" She didn't have the word. "Quiet, I suppose." He dried his hands, turned around. "There'll be a next thing eventually," he said. "There always is. But it doesn't have to be Crowley, and it doesn't have to be now." He looked at her steadily. "You're allowed to just be here, Eliza, in the actual day you're in." She looked at him. "Is that something you learned, or something you're still learning?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to rely on. He didn't perform wisdom, he just tried to be accurate. "Still learning," he said, "but I'm further along than I was last year." She nodded, poured the cold coffee out, and started a fresh pot. "Ethan said something today," she said. Not a word exactly, but it had the shape of one. Cole's expression changed in the way it did for anything involving Ethan, a softening he didn't bother to hide anymore. "What was it?" "I think it was dog," she said. "He was pointing at soot. Could have been anything. Could have been. But it had two sounds and he said it twice and he was looking directly at soot, so—" She looked up at him. "I think it was dog." Cole was quiet for a moment, then, better than his first word being something else. "Like what?" "I don't know. No, I say that to him about 15 times a day." She almost laughed. "He'll get there." "Unfortunately," Cole said, which was as close as he got to a joke, and the kitchen had that quality it got sometimes in the evenings, warm and specific, and theirs, in a way that still occasionally surprised her. The railroad decision came down in August. Not through a letter this time, through actual representatives of the company. Two men who arrived in Blackstone Valley with surveying equipment and formal coats and the self-important bearing of people carrying information that other people wanted. They held a meeting at the town hall, not the council room, the actual hall that was used for occasions requiring more space. The ridge route had been selected. The valley route, the one Crowley had spent 2 years telling people was certain, was not the chosen path. The railroad would cross 12 miles north of Blackstone Valley, over the ridge, through terrain that cost more to build but avoided the complications of valley land acquisition and this was the part that moved through the room like a current, that the company had been quietly concerned about. Ever since their survey, people had begun reporting that a significant portion of the relevant parcels had changed hands recently under what appeared to be speculative circumstances. They didn't say Crowley's name. They didn't have to. Eliza watched the room while the railroad men talked. She watched Turner, who sat with the stillness of a man absorbing something he'd been half expecting and still didn't want to be true. She watched Harmon, who had the greenish quality of someone realizing the extent of a mistake. She watched the faces of men she didn't know well. Farmers, ranchers, small businessmen, who had been told a thing with confidence for 2 years and were now recalibrating everything built on top of that thing. Crowley wasn't at the meeting. That was the detail she turned over afterward, on the ride home. He'd known before the meeting. He must have. The company wouldn't have arrived without advance communication, and a man with Crowley's connections would have found out through channels before the public announcement. He'd known, and he hadn't come to stand in that room and face what his certainty had cost people. That told her something about him, something final. Not a new thing, she'd understood what he was for months, but it closed something. The picture completed itself. "He's already gone," she said to Cole on the road home. Not a question. "His foreman told Peters last week that he was settling some affairs," Cole said. "I think he saw this coming." "So he left before he had to see their faces." "Yes." She thought about that for a while. "Do you feel anything about it, him leaving?" Cole rode without answering for long enough that she thought he might not. Then he said, "I feel like I can start on the north pasture fence without wondering if it's worth the investment." That was such a precise and honest answer that she didn't say anything in response. It was the right kind of relief, not triumphant, not hollow, just the specific satisfaction of a weight that had been present for so long you'd stopped noticing it, lifting, and your body suddenly remembering what it was like to stand straight. The land Crowley had bought in the valley, 8 parcels in total, went through a complicated few months. Kearney's brother-in-law, whose name turned out to be Robert Finch and who was sharper than his unhurried manner suggested, looked at the transaction records and found what he'd suspected. 3 of the sales had been made within months of Crowley receiving correspondence from the railroad that was, at minimum, significantly less certain than what he'd represented to sellers. 2 of the original families, the Aarons and a couple named Garrett, who'd sold in the spring, pursued claims against the estate Crowley had left behind when he departed the territory. It was slow and it was expensive, and Eliza wasn't sure either family would see what they were owed in any reasonable time frame. That was the reality of legal remedy in 1876. It existed, but it moved at its own pace, and the pace had no interest in anyone's urgency. But the land itself was available again, and the prices corrected back to what they should have been without the railroad premium that had never materialized, and 2 of the parcels were bought by Valley families who'd been waiting for the cost to come down. The Valley didn't transform overnight, but it stopped contracting. In September, Gerald Bemis bought the Dillard property and his eldest son started farming it. Gerald told Cole about it outside the feed store, and Cole shook his hand and Gerald said, "Couldn't have done it before," meaning before the prices came down, meaning before Crowley's certainty stopped being certain. Cole nodded and said he was glad, and that was the whole conversation, which was the right length for it. Ethan walked on his own in October. Not the 2-step lurch of February, real walking from one side of the kitchen to the other, unassisted, with the particular drunk sailor gait of a child who's figured out the mechanism but hasn't fully negotiated with gravity yet. Cole was there when it happened. He'd come in early because a fence post needed a part that required him to go to the barn workshop, and he'd passed through the kitchen and stopped in the doorway because Ethan was standing in the middle of the floor with the focused expression of someone consulting an internal document. Then Ethan walked. He went from the table to the stove, 6 feet, 7 steps, 2 wobbles, and a near fall that self-corrected, and then grabbed the handle of the low cabinet door and looked back at Cole as if checking whether this had been witnessed. "I saw it," Cole said. Ethan, apparently satisfied, sat down on the floor. Cole didn't move from the doorway for a moment. He had his hat in his hand. He'd taken it off at the door out of a habit he'd developed around the time of the wedding and had never explained and she'd never asked about. And he was looking at Ethan with an expression that had too many things in it to pull apart cleanly. Eliza was at the window and watched both of them. Cole crouched down, at the floor level he'd started using with Ethan back in December, and held out his hands. Ethan considered this offer with the deliberation of a 1-year-old, decided the distance was acceptable, and walked back across the kitchen to him. 5 steps. Cole's hands caught him at the end, steadied him, held him upright. "Good," Cole said, in the voice he used for the horses, for Ethan, for things he was trying to tell something important without the words being elaborate. "That's real good." Ethan grabbed his nose, which he'd recently discovered was the most effective way to command a human face's attention. Cole went cross-eyed trying to see it. Ethan found this hilarious. Eliza turned back to the window and looked out at the pasture, at the horses moving through the late October light, and let the moment be what it was without narrating it. Oh, the winter of 1876 was harder than the previous one in temperature and easier in every other way. They had more wood laid in, more food in the pantry, properly organized, with enough variety that the months of eating the same 7 things didn't become the kind of grinding sameness that wore people down. Cole had added 6 horses to the operation in late summer. Good stock, 2 of them already trained, the other 4 coming along. And the barn was fuller and busier than it had ever been. Margaret and Agnes came out twice during the worst of it, the way people did in that country, checking on neighbors when the weather made neighbors of everyone. They brought things, dried fruit once, a jar of something preserved that turned out to be the best thing Eliza had eaten since Missouri. And they stayed for the afternoon, and the kitchen was full of voices, and Ethan ran around everyone's legs with the manic energy of a child who'd been cooped up with only adults for weeks and was now faced with an embarrassment of social riches. "He's going to be tall," Margaret said, watching him. "Cole's tall," Eliza said, which was a sentence she could say now without it feeling strange, without the reminder that it had once been a stranger's name. "He's going to have that same quality Cole has," Agnes said. "The still one, where you're not sure if they're thinking or sleeping." "He's awake," Eliza said. "He's always thinking." "Cole or Ethan?" "Both," she said. Agnes looked at her with the clear-eyed directness that was her particular gift. "Are you happy here?" she asked. Not intrusively, just the question, asked plainly because Agnes Lowe had reached the age where plain questions were more efficient. Eliza thought about it. She didn't just say yes from habit. She actually thought about it, which was something she was getting better at, sitting in the actual answer rather than the easy one. "I'm not always happy," she said. "There are days that are hard. Cole and I don't always—" She paused. "We're different kinds of people in some ways. He goes quiet when he's working something out, and sometimes the quiet goes on too long and I say something to break it that isn't what I meant to say, and we have to untangle that." She looked at the window. "There are days I miss things I can't have back. My husband, before he got sick, what that was going to be." She looked at Agnes. "But underneath all of it, yes. Underneath everything that's hard, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad this is where I ended up." Agnes nodded like that was the right answer. Not because it was tidy, but because it was true. "That's what it is," Agnes said. "That's what it actually is, when it's real." In the spring of 1877, the railroad sent representatives for right-of-way negotiation with landowners along the ridge route. Cole met with them twice, once in town and once at the ranch, and negotiated with the particular patience of a man who'd spent years building something and wasn't going to be hurried out of what it was worth. He got what he asked for. Not everything. They came down on the access road provision, and he gave on that, which was the right call. But the payment for the right-of-way easement across the northern corner of his land was fair, and he came home with the signed document and put it in the metal box where he kept important papers and didn't make a speech about it. He did open a bottle of whiskey he'd been keeping for something, which told her more than a speech would have. They had a glass each at the kitchen table after Ethan was in bed, and Cole told her what the number was, and she did the math in her head about what it meant for the horse operation. The expansion that had been theoretical becoming possible, the 40 horses becoming 60, the 60 eventually becoming something that would need a second hand. "That's enough to hire someone," she said. "Next spring, probably." He turned the glass. "If the summer goes well." "The summer will go well," she said. He looked at her. "You sound sure." "I'm not sure," she said. She thought about it. "I've stopped assuming the worst. I don't know when that happened exactly." He was quiet for a moment. "I noticed," he said. "Did you?" "July," he said. "You stopped standing at the kitchen window waiting for something bad to come down the track." She looked at him. "You noticed in July?" "Yes." "And you didn't say anything. Didn't seem like it needed saying." He drank his whiskey. "You figured it out yourself. That's better than me pointing at it." She looked at him across the table, this man who noticed things in July, and waited until March to mention them because he'd decided it wasn't useful to say sooner. She felt, not for the first time, the specific quality of being known by someone. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. The way he saw her was imperfect and partial, and it was still more than most people managed. "Cole?" she said. I love you. She said it plainly, the way you say something you've been sure of for a while and are just now getting around to saying out loud. I don't think I've said it directly. He looked at his glass, then at her. His face did the thing it did when something had landed where he hadn't braced for it, a brief unguarding, like a door opened that he'd forgotten he could open. I know, he said. Then, I love you too. He said it the way he said things that mattered. Not easily, not with decoration, but with the full weight of meaning it. I'm not always good at saying it, she said. I know. You show it in other ways. What ways? You got the thread, she said. He looked confused. What? First winter, you went to town for supplies and I said I needed thread and it wasn't urgent and you said you'd get it. She looked at the table. You got it. That was the first time I thought, he's going to be all right. He's going to be the kind of person you can count on. Cole was quiet for a moment. Thread, he said. Thread, she confirmed. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, more in the way of a man learning something about himself he hadn't known. That's a low bar, he said. You'd be surprised, she said, how few people clear it. Ethan was 4 when Cole taught him to feed the horses. He was serious about it, the way he was serious about most things at 4. The focused, deliberate seriousness of a small person trying to do a large thing correctly. He stood at the stall with the bucket, and he looked at the horse and said, What's his name? Her name, Cole said. Cora. What's wrong with her leg? Her knee doesn't work right, so she can't run the way the others do. Ethan considered this with the 4-year-old's particular form of solemnity. Does it hurt? Not anymore. It did when she was younger. But you kept her. Yes, Cole said. Ethan looked at Cora. Cora looked at Ethan with the patient brown eyes of an animal who'd been around long enough to find people mostly comprehensible. Because she needed somewhere to stay, Ethan said. Not a question. He'd worked it out. Yes, Cole said. Ethan held out the bucket. Cora took what she wanted from it, unhurried. Ethan watched her eat with the solemn attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. Papa, he said. Yeah. Is that why you kept us, me and Mama? Because we needed somewhere to stay? Cole crouched down to Ethan's level. He did it still with the same care he'd always had with him. No sudden movements, the kind of attention that said, I see you without making a production of it. I kept you, Cole said carefully, because you belong here. There's a difference. Ethan thought about this. What's the difference? Needing somewhere to stay is about a place, Cole said. Belonging is about people. You can need a place and be wrong about it, but you can't be wrong about where you belong if the people there are the right ones. Ethan looked at him. Are you the right ones? I think so, Cole said. I think you think so too. Ethan reached over and patted Cole's knee in the particular way he had. 3 pats, which was his version of an agreement. Then he picked the bucket back up and looked at the next stall with the expression of a person who had work to do. Eliza was at the barn door and had heard all of it because the barn was small and Cole's voice carried more than he always realized. She didn't go in. She stood at the door with the late afternoon light at her back and let them have that space. What she thought about, standing there, was the alley behind the saloon, the crate, the cold. $19, and the calculation of what it was going to cost to get to the next town, and whether the next town would be any better. She'd been so close to a version of the future that she didn't want to think about too carefully. Not dangerous exactly, but smaller, thinner. A version of her life that got by without ever having enough to get full on. The distance between that alley and this barn door was not a triumphant story. It was a series of ordinary decisions made by imperfect people. A woman who got on a horse with a stranger because she'd read him right. A man who rode out of town with her because he'd decided the right thing and then done it. A network of other people doing small right things at their own tables and in their own conversations until the small right things had accumulated into something that held. There was no single moment of rescue. That was the thing nobody told you about how hard things ended. They ended in aggregate, in the slow accretion of days that were slightly better than the ones before, in decisions that were slightly less desperate, in a kitchen that got cleaner and a pantry that got fuller and a man who wrote thread on a supply list because she'd mentioned it. She didn't think any of this was a lesson. Or rather, She was suspicious of the word lesson when applied to suffering because lessons implied a purpose behind the pain, and she wasn't sure she believed pain had purpose. What she believed was that people moved through hard things and came out the other side with a certain kind of knowledge that they hadn't had going in, and the knowledge was only useful if you were honest about where it came from. She knew something now about what it cost to be visible, about the specific violence of being made into a story by someone who'd never spoken to you, who'd decided what you were from a distance and then acted on that decision. She knew what it was like to have your worth determined by your category rather than your character, and she knew that knowledge in her body, not as an abstraction, not as a thing she'd read somewhere, but as a thing that had been done to her by specific people on a specific cold night and all the months that followed. She'd also learned, though learned was maybe too clean a word, arrived at was more accurate, that the category could be changed. Not quickly, not without cost. Not by argument or by deserving better, but by the patient work of being a real person in front of enough real people until the story Crowley had built around her couldn't hold its shape against the actual evidence of her living. That was not inspiring exactly. It was just true. Third, the second child came in the winter of 1878, a girl, which surprised Eliza even though she didn't know why it should have, and the birth was harder than Ethan's had been, which was saying something. Margaret came out to help, and Agnes, and there was a night in February that Cole spent in the kitchen pretending to do things with the fire that required his attention, so he didn't have to name what he was actually doing, which was being afraid. She knew he was afraid. She didn't say so. She was doing her own work in the back room with Margaret and Agnes, and the fear was something they were both carrying in their own way, and the best thing they could do for each other was get through it. The girl came out fine, loud and red and healthy, and when Cole came to the door and looked at her, the specific expression on his face when he looked at her, Eliza felt the same thing she'd felt in Margaret's parlor, watching him with Ethan. Not quite happiness, because happiness was too small a word for it. Something with more weight than that. The recognition that a life had changed irrevocably and in the right direction. "What do you want to call her?" Cole said. He was holding the baby with the same care he'd always had with Ethan, that patient, specific attention. "I want to name her Agnes," Eliza said, "if you don't object." He looked at her. "Agnes Mercer," he said, trying it. "Agnes Mercer." He looked at the baby. "Agnes," he said quietly. The baby didn't respond, being approximately 12 minutes old and occupied with other matters. "She'll like that," he said, meaning Agnes Lowe, which turned out to be correct. Cole hired a second hand in the spring of 1879, a young man named Samuel from 2 valleys over who knew horses and didn't talk excessively, which were Cole's 2 main requirements. By then they had 58 horses in operation, and the reputation of the Mercer Ranch for quality stock had reached far enough that buyers came from places Cole hadn't expected to get customers from. It hadn't happened dramatically. It had happened the way solid things happen, through consistent work and fair dealing over years, through horses that were what Cole said they were, and people who'd bought one coming back for another. Word spread the way good word spreads, not all at once, but reliably. Turner from the town council bought 2 horses for his sons. Gerald Bemis bought one for the farm. A man came from 80 miles east specifically for a gray mare that Cole had trained himself and priced fairly. And she was, the man said, when he came back 6 months later with a friend who also wanted a horse, the best animal he'd bought in 20 years. Cole didn't repeat that to Eliza. She heard it from Peters, who'd heard it in the feed store. That was the kind of man Cole was. The praise didn't go in or come out differently than the criticism. He just kept working. The summer Ethan turned 7, he asked to help with the breaking of a young horse, a 3-year-old chestnut gelding that had come in from a sale and had opinions about things. Cole said no. Ethan argued with the precision of a 7-year-old who had spent his whole life watching a man who built arguments from evidence rather than volume. He said he'd been watching for 2 years. He said he knew the signals. He said he would stay behind the rail and only move when Cole told him to. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "When you're 9. Why 9? Because at 9 your reflexes will be fast enough to be useful instead of a problem." "How do you know?" "Because I was 9 when I started," Cole said, "and even at 9 I was almost too slow twice." Ethan absorbed this. What happened the 2 times? The first time the horse moved left when I was expecting right and I hit the rail. Cole showed him, without dramatics, a faint scar above his wrist. Second time I was fast enough. Ethan looked at the scar with the 7-year-old's complete absorption in this kind of detail. Did it hurt? Yes. Were you scared? Cole thought about it. After, he said. During, I was too busy. Ethan nodded slowly, processing. Okay, he said. 9. 9, Cole confirmed. Eliza, who'd been listening from near the barn door, she was always near the barn door, apparently, for these conversations, thought, that is the best thing you can give a child. Not protection from every hard thing, just the truth about which hard things are worth it and when. She didn't say that. She thought it and held it and carried it with her, the way you carry things you've understood late, but truly. Margaret Pruitt asked Eliza once, in the autumn of 1879, what she would have done if Cole hadn't come out of that crowd that November night. They were at Margaret's table, which was where they always seemed to have the real conversations, some quality of that kitchen producing honesty. And Ethan was outside somewhere with Thomas Pruitt learning about something, and Agnes, the younger, was in Eliza's lap being opinionated about a spoon. Eliza thought about the question seriously. I'd have gotten through the night somehow, she said. I was working that out when he arrived. And after. I'd have gotten to Harder Creek, tried again there. She looked at the window. I'd have found something eventually. It would have been harder, and Ethan's life would have been different, but she paused. I would have managed. You're sure? I have to be sure, Eliza said. Because if I thought Cole was the only way I would have survived, then I'm here because of luck, and that's too thin a foundation to stand on. She looked at Margaret. I'm here because of him, and because of the choices I made, and because of you and Agnes and Peters, and a dozen other people who did small right things. She settled Agnes on her hip. Nobody saved me. We built something. That's different. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. When did you figure that out? Gradually, Eliza said. The way you figure out most things that matter. Quote, Cole found her one evening in late October, sitting on the porch steps in the cold, the way she sometimes did when she needed to be outside without going anywhere. He sat down next to her, not asking why, not suggesting she come inside, just sitting. They looked at the pasture. The horses were moving in the last of the light, their shapes dark against the pale grass, and the sky to the west was doing the thing it did in autumn in that country, going every color it knew before it gave up and went to dark. You thinking? He said. Always, she said. Anything specific? She looked at the horses, at the barn, at the fence lines Cole had rebuilt over 3 years, section by section, until they were what he'd wanted them to be from the start. At the land that sat exactly where Crowley had needed it to sit, and that was still theirs. More theirs now, in the specific way that years of working something makes it yours in a way that a deed alone doesn't. Do you remember the first morning, she said, when I made oatmeal from what I found in the pantry? I remember, he said. The kitchen was a disaster. It was, he agreed. I was scared, she said. I didn't let you see it, but I was terrified. I didn't know if you were a good man or just a man who'd done a decent thing once. She looked at the sky. I ate standing at the counter because I didn't know if I had the right to sit down at the table. He was quiet for a moment. You had the right, he said. I know that now. She looked at him. It took a while. He nodded. Cole. She shifted to look at him directly. I want you to know that whatever comes next, more winters, more hard decisions, whatever it is, I'm not scared the way I was. Not because things are easy, because I know who I'm in it with. He looked at her with the expression she knew best on him now. The one that had nothing performed about it. No management of what showed, just what was actually there. That's the same for me, he said, in case you didn't know. I knew, she said. He put his arm around her, which he did sometimes in these outside moments, the casual weight of it that meant nothing required and everything present. She leaned into him slightly, which was her answer, and they sat there while the sky finished its work and the horses settled and the cold came down off the high country with its usual intention. Inside, Ethan and Agnes were doing whatever they were doing. There were sounds, intermittent, the specific sounds of children who had been told to be quiet and were compromising. In the barn, Samuel was doing the last rounds of the evening. The fence lines held. The horses were where they should be. It wasn't a perfect life. It was going to keep being imperfect. There would be losses she couldn't predict yet. Winters that tried them, arguments that took longer to resolve than they should, days when the weight of ordinary living pressed down in the specific way it does when you're tired and the end of the hard thing isn't visible from where you're standing. But it was real. It was built from real material, the kind of material that starts as nothing, as a crate in an alley and a cold night and a stranger's horse, and $23 and the nerve to say what you could offer to a man you'd known for 4 minutes. What she knew, sitting on that porch in October with her husband's arm around her and 2 children making noise inside and 58 horses breathing in the dark, was this. The life that looked most like surviving had turned out to be the one where she'd stopped treating survival as the goal. The goal was this, right here. The ongoing, imperfect, irreplaceable work of building something with people you'd chosen and who had chosen you back. Everything else was just weather.